Welcome back to the Re-Entry Archive. In today's video, we're diving into one of the most misunderstood, yet central parts of the psyche, the ego. In everyday language, the ego often means arrogance or selfishness, but in Jungian psychology, the ego is much more than that. It's the organizing principle of consciousness. It is the part of us that says, I am. In this episode, we'll explore what the ego archetype is, how it came to be understood, the lessons it teaches us, its dangers and shadow forms, and how the ego often appears in psychedelic experiences. The term ego comes from the Latin word for I. In psychology, Freud first used it to describe the conscious self-navigating between instincts and society. Jung adopted the term, but refined it. For Jung, the ego is not the whole personality. It is the centre of consciousness, the lighted area of the psyche that we identify with. Beyond it lies the unconscious, the shadow, and ultimately the self. Jung often compared the ego to a small island floating on a vast ocean. It is important, but it is not the totality. The ego archetype is our sense of identity. It is the inner narrator that organizes experience. It represents conscious awareness, what we know and what we perceive directly. It is personal identity, our story of who we are, our values and our memories. It aids with decision making, ability to choose and to act. It also promotes boundary keeping, as it distinguishes me from not me. The ego, therefore, is essential. Without it, we would have no stable identity, no ability to function, and no coherent life story. However, it is not the king of the psyche. It is simply one part of the larger system. The ego archetype shows up in many myths and stories, often symbolized by the hero or the individual self, trying to assert themselves in the vast world. In Greek myth, Odysseus represents a strong ego. He is resourceful, cunning, but constantly tested by forces larger than himself. In Hindu philosophy, the Ankara, the eye maker, is similar to the ego and presents itself as the sense of individuality within the cosmos. In Buddhism, the ego is often depicted as an illusion, a grasping sense of self that must be transcended in order to reach enlightenment. And in modern culture, stories about finding yourself, building identity, or standing out from the crowd often portray the journey of the ego. These traditions and narratives highlight both the necessity and the limitations of the ego. So what does the ego archetype teach us? Firstly, identity is necessary. We need an I to navigate life, to make decisions, and to grow. Secondly, boundaries help protect us. The ego creates a sense of self that keeps us safe from being overwhelmed. Thirdly, the ego is not the whole. it must recognise that it serves the larger self, the total psyche. And lastly, flexibility is strength. A healthy ego adapts. It can change, grow, without shattering. The ego's greatest lesson is one of balance. It must be strong enough to hold us together, but humble enough to know that it isn't everything. It might be obvious, therefore, that the ego has its own shadow forms, and there are several ways in which it can become problematic. Ego inflation. The ego becomes to believe it is the self. This can lead to arrogance, grandiosity, and even delusion. Ego fragility. The ego becomes too weak, leading to insecurity, dependency, or collapse under pressure. Ego identification. The ego fuses with the roles of possessions or beliefs, forgetting its deeper foundation. Ego resistance. The ego fears change and clings to control, blocking and hindering growth. In essence, when the ego becomes inflated or too rigid, it cuts us off from the unconscious and larger self. When it becomes too weak, we tend to lose stability. Few archetypes are as relevant to psychedelics as the ego. The term ego death has become common in describing profound psychedelic states. In high doses, psychedelics can dissolve the ego's boundaries, leading to a sense of unity with all things. This can either be blissful or terrifying. Some experience ego inflation, visions of being godlike or omnipotent, which can teach humility if integrated appropriately. Others confront the fragility of identity, realizing their usual self-story is impermanent. The psychedelic encounter with the ego is a paradox. It shows both the necessity of the ego and its impermanence. We need it to live, but we are not limited to it. In summary, the ego archetype is the centre of consciousness. It is the censored I. It appears in myths and philosophies as the individual hero or identity maker. Its lessons are about building identity, protecting boundaries, and learning humility before the larger self. Its shadow forms include overinflation, fragility, over-identification, and resistance. In psychedelic experiences, the ego often dissolves, inflates, or transforms, revealing both its necessity and its limits. Ultimately, the ego archetype teaches us that we are more than the stories we tell ourselves, but that these stories are still vital. The task, therefore, is not to destroy the ego, but to develop it, to strengthen it, and then to recognize its place within the greater whole of the self. Thank you for watching, and if this exploration of the ego archetype resonated with you, be sure to subscribe and share your reflections in the comments. Has your own ego helped or hindered you in your journey so far?